Chapter 1. The First Chalk Line Word Count. 700. The winter of 1852 held Wexford, Vermont in a grip that felt older than the town itself, as if the cold had seeped up from the earth's bones rather than fallen from the sky. Snow did not fall gently here. It arrived in silent sheets, muffling every sound until footsteps seemed swallowed before they even touched the ground. On such a morning, when the streets were emptied of all but the most desperate, Clara Whitlow was found kneeling in the orphanage yard, her thin frame wrapped in a coat far too large, her small red hands pressed into the snow. At first it appeared she was playing, scratching idle lines into the hard crust of ice with a bit of broken chalk. But the closer one looked, the less the lines resembled the innocent meanderings of a child. She was shaping something deliberate, something that required her full concentration. A circle interrupted by a rigid vertical bar, its edges sharpened with care, the symmetry unnerving. The chalk was worn down to a sliver, and yet she worked as if she had no intention of stopping, as if the cold were nothing but a faint nuisance. The matron's voice carried faintly from the door, calling her in for breakfast. Clara did not turn. Her breath fogged the air in short, even bursts, eyes fixed on the snow as if the symbol were telling her something only she could hear. When a hand was placed gently on her shoulder, she startled, not because she had been caught, but because she seemed to have forgotten the world existed. The matron scolded her for ruining her gloves, but when Clara looked up, she didn't apologize. She simply glanced down at her work one last time, her expression unreadable, and let herself be led inside. By midday, the symbol had been buried beneath fresh snow. That evening, she was gone. No footprints left the orphanage yard. The front door was still bolted from the inside. Her bed was neatly made, the blanket tucked so tightly it looked untouched. A single scrap of white chalk lay on her pillow. The older children whispered about it for hours, their voices hushed and trembling. But by morning the matter had dissolved into the thick silence that Wexford carried in its marrow. Adults spoke of it only in passing, and never when others could hear. A search party was formed for appearance's sake, combing the woods and the frozen riverbank. Though those who went out admitted privately they were not looking for Clara. They were looking for something else entirely, something they prayed not to find. It was not the first time a child had gone missing in Wexford, but Clara's disappearance carried a different weight. The older townsfolk claimed they had seen marks like hers before, though they would not say when or where. They spoke of them in fragmented thoughts, always followed by an abrupt change of subject, as though the act of describing them would invite something nearer. A merchant's wife mentioned in a moment of unguarded fear that her brother had vanished decades earlier after carving a similar sign into the frame of their family's barn. She never spoke of it again. The snow held its secrets well. Beneath it, the yard was still, the old elm trees heavy with frost, their branches sagging like tired arms. If someone had stood there long enough, they might have seen the faintest depression where Clara had knelt, her knees leaving small hollows in the ground, preserved by the freeze. And if one were to dig just slightly beneath that spot, the thin crust of ice might have revealed a darker soil, compacted and strange, as if something had been pressed into it long before Clara ever touched chalk to snow. Night came quickly that winter, swallowing the sky by late afternoon. From the orphanage windows, the world outside seemed drained of all color. The matron instructed the children to stay away from the yard, saying the ice was treacherous, though the way her eyes lingered on the elm trees suggested another reason entirely. The older children obeyed. The younger ones sometimes crept to the glass to stare out at the pale, untouched expanse where Clara had been. None of them dared step outside. By the week's end, her name was no longer spoken in the halls. The bed where she had slept was reassigned. Her belongings, 2 dresses, a ribbon, a small book of pressed flowers, were given to others without ceremony. It was as though she had been swallowed not just by the snow, but by the town's own willful forgetfulness. The symbol she drew would be remembered only by those who had seen it, and even they would learn to keep it locked in the darker corners of their minds. But it was there still, unseen beneath the ice, waiting for the next small hand to trace it again. And when it happened, the town would fall silent all over. Jonathan Hale arrived in Wexford on a pale morning when the frost lay like lace along the orphanage windows, and the air smelled faintly of ash from the mill chimneys. He stepped down from the carriage with the quiet poise of a man who believed deeply in order. Every movement measured, every glance controlled. His coat was black but clean, without the fraying or salt stains common to winter wear here, and when he smiled it was with a warmth that seemed to soften the rigid angles of his face. The townspeople, burdened by the recent disappearance, found his presence oddly comforting, as if the institution itself had been handed to steadier hands. They did not yet notice how often his eyes wandered toward the children, not with crude hunger or paternal affection, but with the curiosity of a man studying the inner workings of a clock. Within days of taking his post, Hale introduced small changes to the orphanage routine. Morning prayers became longer, and the children were encouraged to describe their dreams in detail before breakfast. He listened with gentle attentiveness, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book he kept in his pocket. He seemed especially interested in patterns. Recurring images, repeated shapes, half-remembered songs. He told the staff it was a way to nurture creativity, to make the children feel heard. But in private, he lingered on certain accounts, asking the same questions in different ways until the child's voice grew uneasy. To Hale, these moments were not idle chatter. They were data points, pieces of a larger design he alone could see. He began introducing imaginative exercises in the afternoons, guiding the children in games that involved tracing patterns in chalk or arranging stones in precise formations on the floor. When a shape appeared more naturally in one child's work than another's, his interest sharpened. He praised them softly, telling them they had an instinct, and often found subtle ways to isolate them from the others for more personal guidance. The staff took this as special mentorship for the gifted, and his soft-spoken manner disarmed suspicion. He never raised his voice, never struck a child, never showed open anger. His control was absolute, and that was its own kind of violence, the kind that leaves no bruise yet reaches bone. Hale's quarters were modest but unnervingly precise, books aligned by height and shade, drawers arranged so neatly one could tell at a glance if anything was missing. On his desk sat the same leather book in which he recorded the children's dreams, now joined by sheets of thin parchment marked with delicate diagrams, not of buildings or machines, but of bodies, each sketched in proportion to abstract shapes and ratios. At night, after the halls had fallen silent, he would study them by lamplight, occasionally making a single adjustment to a line or number, his pen moving with surgical care. It was not anatomy in the medical sense, but in the way an architect studies a cathedral's weight-bearing arches, as though the human form was a structure to be refined. To the townsfolk, he was the picture of benevolence. He attended Sunday service without fail, offering modest donations from his own salary to aid the poor. His voice was steady when he spoke of moral duty and the sanctity of young lives, and people found it easy to forget that sanctity can mean different things to different minds. In the hush of the orphanage halls, among the restless dreams of children, Jonathan Hale was already laying the groundwork for something intricate, something that required patience and trust. The first steps of his design would be invisible to those around him, but to Hale they were essential. For nothing enduring is ever built without a perfect foundation. And as the winter deepened, That foundation began to take shape beneath the very floorboards of Wexford's faith in him. The first time the symbol appeared in the classroom, it was small and almost careless, drawn into the margin of an arithmetic sheet by a boy named Samuel Price. A single curling spiral interrupted by a rigid vertical line, jagged at the ends as though made in haste. The teacher, assuming it was a child's idle doodle, made him erase it without comment. But the next week it appeared again, this time in the corner of another child's slate, etched so deep the chalk nearly split in two. Soon it was everywhere. Some children carved it faintly into the wood of their desks, others traced it in the condensation on the windows. The lines were never perfect, never identical, yet there was something in the way they leaned toward the same crooked symmetry that made the teachers uneasy. It was not the playful randomness of childhood games. It was repetition with a purpose. Jonathan Hale noticed it almost immediately, though he pretended otherwise. He passed between the rows of desks with his soft, approving smile, occasionally placing a hand on a child's shoulder and tilting his head to observe their work. When his eyes fell on the symbol, his attention sharpened, but only for a moment, the kind of glance so brief no one would think to notice. In truth, he was cataloging it. He kept a mental ledger of who drew it, how often, and with what variation. To him, the symbol was not just an image, but a sign of something latent, a whisper rising from the subconscious. It marked those who could be shaped. The other staff assumed it was a fad, like skipping rhymes or carved initials. Children, after all, who invented strange little worlds for themselves. But in Wexford, the air was different now. The symbol seemed to hold its own weight, as if it carried a meaning none of the adults could quite place. Some claimed they had seen it before, though they could not recall where. Others dismissed it entirely, choosing not to think about the fact that Clara Whitlow had been seen drawing something eerily similar the day she vanished. Then came the matter of Ruth Carver. She was quiet, careful, the sort of child who never invited reprimand. One bleak Thursday morning, during the lull between lessons, she took a fragment of slate from the floor and began scratching the symbol into the palm of her own hand. The noise was faint but distinct, a dry, gritty scrape of stone on skin. She worked slowly, pressing hard enough for the chalky dust to cling in the shallow grooves she made. The teacher noticed and scolded her, wiping her palm with a damp cloth. Ruth only looked at her, expression blank, before returning to her seat. She didn't draw anything else that day. That night she was gone. The disappearance was quieter this time, handled with the hushed efficiency of people who had learned not to ask too much. The matron said Ruth had run away. The constable agreed. No one searched the yard or the nearby woods. By morning, the children had stopped speaking her name, but they had not stopped drawing the mark. If anything, it appeared more often now, not in rebellion, but in a strange, shared silence. They worked on their lessons as usual, but their hands moved toward it almost unconsciously, slipping it between lines of text, tucking it behind the edges of numbers, as though hiding it from the teachers but not from each other. Hale's demeanor remained unchanged, though his nightly study sessions grew longer. Alone in his quarters, he drew the symbol again and again, comparing the subtle differences from each child's version. The spiral was the constant. The bar's placement, angle, and weight varied, as if each child heard the same song but hummed it in their own pitch. To Hale, it was proof of something he had always believed, that certain minds, untouched by adult reason, carried an instinct toward forms that had meaning beyond language. The symbol, he thought, was an opening, and openings could be widened. By the end of the month, nearly half the orphanage had marked the sign somewhere. Scratched in the dirt of the yard, etched under the edge of a bed frame, or drawn faintly on the inside of a sleeve where only the wearer could see it. The teachers no longer tried to erase them all. It was easier to let the children play their strange game. to let the symbol live quietly in the corners where adults rarely looked. But Hale looked. He saw every line, every curve, every hesitant stroke that hinted at the pull of something deep and old. And when his gaze lingered, it was not in fear or confusion. It was in anticipation, for he knew the pattern was not complete yet. And when it was, it would call to the ones he had been waiting for all along. It was during the first thaw of March that the ledger was found, hidden behind the false back of a desk drawer in Jonathan Hale's quarters. The discovery came by accident, when a loose nail caught the edge of a rag as one of the staff dusted the room. The panel slid forward with a reluctant scrape, revealing a thin, leather-bound book bound so tightly it seemed to resist the touch. Its cover was plain, worn smooth by hands that had opened it many times, yet the edges were sharp, unfrayed. Inside, the pages were filled with a neat, unwavering hand. Black ink that had not faded, letters shaped with mechanical precision, as if each had been drafted under a ruler's edge. There were names, each belonging to a child who had vanished from the orphanage over the years. Beside them were dates written in a cold chronological sequence and long columns of numbers whose purpose was not immediately clear. The script was devoid of emotion, the same care given to recording the weather as to recording the absence of a human life. The most unsettling entries were not the names but the illustrations that followed. They were not portraits or scenes but anatomical sketches. Ribs drawn to scale, the curve of a spine annotated with measurements, the exact dimensions of a child's femur compared against a spiral overlay that mirrored the strange symbol the children had been drawing. These diagrams had the sterile feel of engineering blueprints, each bone rendered with lines so fine they seemed etched rather than drawn. Along the margins were notations in Hale's hand, short phrases like adjusted ratio, incomplete form, and alignment off by 2 degrees. There was no mention of death, no acknowledgement of cruelty, only the impersonal language of construction and correction, as though the children were components in a design that was slowly approaching perfection. The staff member who found the ledger closed it quickly, but not quickly enough to unsee its contents. The paper smelled faintly of something medicinal, a lingering tang of alcohol or oil, suggesting it had been handled with care, protected against time. It was clear from the density of entries that the work had been going on for years, perhaps longer than anyone in Wexford dared to think. There were no gaps in the records, no forgotten names. Every vanished child had been accounted for in Hale's steady hand, each reduced to a sequence of figures and a sketch of the body they once inhabited. That night, Hale noticed the drawer had been disturbed. He lingered there longer than necessary, fingers resting lightly on the false panel. But he did not confront anyone. Instead, he locked the ledger away in a small iron box, one that he kept beside his bed from that moment on. If anyone wondered why, they did not ask. The ledger had already done its work. For those who had seen even a single page, the quiet horror lay not in the thought of what Hale had done, but in the cold certainty that he had done it without hesitation, without remorse, and without ever believing it was wrong. And for him, the book was not a record of the past. It was a blueprint for what came next. The storage wing had been locked for years, its corridor thick with dust and the stale air of abandonment. The key was found in a jar of loose nails, its metal dull with age, and when the rusted lock gave way, it did so with a groan that seemed to echo far beyond the walls. Inside, the air was strangely cold, carrying a faint sweetness that did not belong in a place left to decay. The source of it became clear when the lamplight fell across the far wall. Rows of shelves stood in perfect alignment, each lined with glass jars so spotless they caught the light like mirrors. Inside every jar lay something pale, delicate, and folded with impossible care. Thin portions of human skin, small enough to belong only to children. each crease so precise it looked like the work of an artist shaping paper into forms that obeyed their own secret geometry. None of the folds were random. Some had been pressed into symmetrical diamonds, others into spirals that matched the crude chalk symbol, their edges tucked with a skill that made them seem almost mechanical. The skin had not shriveled or discolored with time. It was soft and whole, as though taken only hours ago. The smell of anise hung in the air, clinging to the glass as if the jars themselves exhaled it. It was not the scent of decay masked by perfume, but something else entirely. Sharp and strangely clean, a sweetness that felt at odds with the nature of what it preserved. No one could say what method had kept the skin so intact. There was no fluid inside, no visible stitching or treatment. It was as though the flesh had been coaxed into stillness, its life drawn out but its form untouched. To touch the glass was to feel a faint chill, as if the contents were held in a season separate from the world outside. The room bore no signs of chaos or haste. Every jar was placed exactly 3 inches from its neighbor. Labels written in the same neat hand as the ledger in Hale's quarters. Names, dates, and occasionally a number or shape in the margin. The symmetry of the arrangement suggested a mind that could not allow disorder, that saw in these folds of skin not violence but completion. Each piece had been reduced to its purest proportions, stripped of what made it human and arranged into what Hale must have believed was its true form. To stand in that room was to feel the weight of a truth too sharp to name. That this was not the work of rage or impulse, but of devotion. The jars were not trophies, not in the way killers are said to keep them. They were components collected with patience and preserved for a purpose that had not yet been fulfilled. And as the lamplight trembled across the glass, it became clear that the room was not abandoned at all. It was waiting. The winter storm came without warning, rolling over Wexford in a wall of white that erased the horizon and swallowed every sound. The wind scraped against the orphanage walls like 1,000 dry hands, rattling the shutters and forcing snow through the smallest cracks. Inside, the children huddled in their beds, their breaths mingling in the cold air, while the staff moved quietly through the halls, tending the stoves that could never seem to keep the frost from creeping back in. In the smallest bed by the far window lay Elias, a boy whose bones seemed too light for his frame, his skin so pale it caught the moonlight even in darkness. He had coughed himself to sleep earlier that evening, his frail chest rising and falling with a rhythm that always seemed on the edge of failing. By morning, he was gone. There were no footprints in the snow outside his window, no sign that the door had opened in the night. The storm had sealed the world shut, yet somehow he had slipped from it entirely. His blanket was still tucked under the thin mattress, undisturbed except for a single mark at its center. Beneath it, burned into the straw stuffing, was the symbol. The spiral split by a rigid vertical bar, blackened into the fibers as if seared there by flame. But when a hand was placed against it, there was no warmth, no lingering heat, only the brittle coolness of material long left untouched. The edges of the burn were sharp, clean, without the charred crumble of true fire. It was not a natural mark. It was deliberate. The staff whispered of accidents and pranks, but the air in the room carried none of the chaos of either. It felt instead like a space that had been measured and prepared, as if the act of taking Elias had been planned with the same precision as the diagrams in Hale's ledger. His absence was not noisy or frantic. It was neat, contained, a subtraction so clean it felt less like an event and more like the quiet closing of a door. Hale stood at the foot of the bed longer than anyone else, his eyes fixed on the cold burn. He traced its outline without touching it, his gaze neither shocked nor confused but contemplative, as though checking the accuracy of a long-anticipated result. Outside, the storm raged on, piling snow against the orphanage walls, sealing the building tighter with every passing hour. Search parties were impossible. The town accepted quickly that Elias had been lost to the weather, the same way they had accepted the others, by refusing to let their minds linger on the details. But in the silent hours after dark, when the wind fell to a low moan, the staff swore they could hear faint, rhythmic sounds in the distance, like something creaking under a slow, careful strain. And though no one dared say it aloud, the thought pressed on them heavily. Whatever had taken Elias had not fought the storm to do so. It had moved through it untouched, as if the blizzard had been nothing more than a curtain closing to keep the rest of the world from seeing what came next. The truth did not reveal itself in one moment of shock, but in a slow tightening of threads, each detail drawing closer until the pattern could no longer be denied. The ledger, which at first seemed a morbid account of names and dates, became something far stranger when the sketches were studied in silence. They were not the wild scrawls of a fevered mind, but the careful renderings of someone who understood proportion the way a mason understands stone. Each page was ruled with faint pencil lines overlaid with shapes. Spirals intersecting triangles, arcs traced so perfectly they seemed carved rather than drawn. And within these shapes lay the outline of human forms, each segmented into measurements that matched not anatomy textbooks but the mathematics of beauty and balance. The curves of a rib cage were aligned to a perfect ratio. The span of a hand was divided by numbers that had nothing to do with growth or age but with symmetry, with the way a structure could be altered and still remain whole in appearance. The unsettling part was not the artistry but the practicality. In delicate notations, Hale had marked which bones could be removed without breaking the outer skin, which tendons could be shortened without halting the pulse for more than a minute, how far the jaw could be narrowed before speech became a permanent whisper. His handwriting was small, even almost gentle in its formality, as though these instructions were not about living beings at all, but about repairing furniture or tuning an instrument. In his logic, the human body was not sacred. It was an object designed to be improved upon, a flawed geometry begging to be corrected. There were no names on these diagrams, only numbers, measurements of height, weight, limb span, skull diameter, paired with clean mathematical ratios. The names were kept separately in the ledger's index, as if identity was a distraction from the purity of the work. The deeper the pages were turned, the clearer the pattern became. The victims were not chosen for their weakness or opportunity. They were selected because their bodies fit an equation. A girl with unusually long fingers, a boy with narrow hips, a child whose skull circumference fell just shy of the adult average. Each had been mapped, adjusted in theory before they were ever touched in reality. There were no signs of rush or fear in the planning. This was not the violence of impulse, but the fulfillment of a design. Even the act of killing seemed secondary to the precision of alteration. Death was not the goal. It was a byproduct of reaching the perfect form. In one set of sketches, an entire body was shown in stages of transformation, not decomposed or broken, but restructured. A femur shortened, a clavicle removed, the rib cage compressed to bring the torso into harmony with the golden spiral that curved across the page. The final drawing showed a figure that was almost human, yet subtly wrong. The proportions too exact, the symmetry unnatural, the balance so flawless it became unnerving to behold. It was the kind of perfection that made the mind recoil, the way a doll's face can seem more disturbing than a scar. By the time the last pages were reached, the horror was no longer in what Hale had done, but in why. He was not recording cruelty. He was preserving knowledge, refining a method. The ledger was not a confession, but a manual, a set of instructions for anyone who shared his vision. The drawings carried the same cold persistence as architectural plans. Blueprints meant not for one creation, but for many. It left the reader with the sickening awareness that the killings were not the end of the work. They were merely the measurements before construction began. And somewhere in the quiet spaces of Hale's mind, the design was still unfinished. The chapel had stood silent for decades, its bell tower a hollow silhouette against the sky, leaning slightly from years of uncorrected strain. Dust and ivy had claimed its stones, and the great bronze bell hung motionless, as though the air around it had thickened into a permanent stillness. For most, the place was a relic too forgotten to bother with, but for those who had read the scattered fragments of Hale's private notes, the bell was not a relic at all. It was a container. The records hinted at a resonator for the true measure, and though no one could explain the phrase, the shape drawn beside it matched the bell exactly. When the rusted bolts were finally loosened and the bell lowered from its frame, the men who stood around it could not at first name what they were seeing. The interior was wrong, not simply corroded or cracked, but lined with something pale beneath the film of dust, a faint spiral climbing the inside as if the bronze had been decorated from within. It took the slow, careful brushing away of grime to reveal that the pale pattern was not paint or mineral buildup. It was bone. Tiny bones, each no longer than a child's finger, but curved in a way that was unmistakable to anyone who had studied anatomy. They were jawbones, mandibles no larger than those found in a child of no more than 7 years old. Dozens of them had been fused together, end to end, their teeth still locked in small, silent smiles. The spiral they formed was flawless in its proportion, the curvature narrowing toward the top until it vanished into the crown of the bell. Every jawbone had been polished, smoothed of its porous texture, and fixed into the bronze with some resin-like substance that had darkened to the color of old honey. The spiral was not decorative, it was deliberate. The angles matched the same mysterious symbol burned into Elias's straw mattress and sketched in the margins of Hale's ledger. It was the precision that unsettled most. Whoever had done this had not worked in haste. Each bone had been measured, filed, and shaped so that the spiral would remain unbroken. The gaps between them were barely the width of a fingernail. There was no sign of chipping, no rough edges, the kind of work that could only be done with steady hands, sharp tools, and time. Too much time. And yet, beyond the technical horror, there was a deeper, more intimate violation in the choice of material. These were not anonymous fragments stolen from graves. Each jaw was unique, each small set of teeth bearing the subtle irregularities of growth. A crooked incisor, a tiny gap, a milk tooth still rooted. Whoever assembled them had known these details, perhaps even studied them before removal, selecting each bone as if it were a note in some hidden melody. The purpose of such a construction was harder to grasp. Some speculated that the spiral was intended to amplify sound, that when the bell rang, the air passing over those teeth would give the toll an unearthly quality. But no one could remember hearing it ring in living memory, and those who had the means to test it hesitated, as if the act itself might summon whatever purpose Hale had intended. Others believed the spiral was not for sound at all, but for containment, that the bones, bound in a perfect curve, were meant to hold something within the bronze, something that could not be seen but could be called. The resin that fixed them in place smelled faintly sweet like anise, the same scent found in the glass jars of the storage wing. It was a detail too precise to be coincidence. The bell's weight seemed to grow the longer one stared into it. It was as though the spiral pulled at the eye, guiding the gaze upward into the narrowing coil, demanding the mind follow its curve to the unseen point where it ended. Even in silence, it suggested movement, as if the geometry itself carried a rhythm only certain minds could hear. For those who had spent too long studying Hale's work, it was easy to imagine him standing beneath it, head tilted, listening to a tone no one else could detect, a tone formed not from metal or air, but from the harmony of bones arranged in absolute proportion. The horror was not only in what the bell was made from, but in the thought that its creator had found beauty in it, that to him this was not desecration but refinement. When the chapel was abandoned, no one had bothered to remove the bell. It was left to hang, its mouth forever closed to the wind, its secret spiraled within. And yet the records showed that Hale had visited the chapel many times during his confinement. Standing alone beneath the tower in winter nights when the air was still enough for sound to carry for miles. No one could say what he was waiting for. Some believed he hoped the bell would ring on its own, that the pattern within would one day answer him back. But in the end, the bell remained silent, holding in its hollow what it had been given, waiting for a hand that would dare to wake it. The lantern should not have been there. It stood alone at the edge of the frozen marsh, just beyond the asylum's crumbling perimeter wall, as though someone had placed it there deliberately and stepped back into the shadows to watch. At first glance, it seemed nothing more than a relic left behind by some long-dead groundskeeper, its brass frame tarnished, its glass fogged with frost. But the closer one came, the more the frost revealed itself not as a surface dusting, but as part of something larger. A dense, glassy block that had swallowed the lantern entirely, sealing it in as though time itself had poured ice over it. The air was still, the cold so sharp it made breath vanish quickly, but this ice was different from the natural crust on the marsh. It was clearer, heavier, without cracks or air pockets, as if it had been poured and set with intent. And through that clarity, faint shapes emerged within the lantern's fogged panes. The human mind resists certain patterns not out of ignorance but from instinct, because it knows what it sees cannot be. That was the sensation when the ice finally melted enough to expose what was inside. There, within the brass frame and behind the thick lantern glass, was Clara. Not the memory of her, not the skeletal remains the marsh might have stripped over years, but Clara herself. Skin smooth, hair pressed flat by the curve of the glass, her pale face tilted down as if in sleep. Yet the longer the gaze lingered, the more the wrongness of her form began to show. Her body was not folded, nor curled as one might curl against cold. It had been rearranged. Bones drawn in, joints forced past their natural limits, every limb pulled inward until the entire skeleton formed a sphere, compact and complete, as if she had been built to fit the exact internal volume of the lantern. Her skin bore no cuts, no tearing, no signs of struggle, and yet the rearrangement was total. The bones beneath had been broken and reset so precisely that the surface remained flawless, stretched only where it needed to accommodate the impossible shape. Those who had known her could not reconcile the form inside the lantern with the girl they remembered. Her laughter in the courtyard, the way she had been quick to fetch water for the older patients, her soft way of speaking. Clara had been harmless. Hale had known that, and it was that harmlessness that seemed to make her selection all the more calculated. He had not chosen her out of rage or convenience. He had chosen her as one might choose the perfect blank page on which to draw a circle without flaw. The work it would have taken to create such a sphere from a human frame defied both the body's natural resistance and the clock's unrelenting pace. Every joint would have needed dislocation, every bone careful repositioning so that no skin split and no blood spoiled the surface. It was the work of someone who did not see a person at all, only a shape waiting to be made. The ice surrounding the lantern had its own unsettling qualities. Embedded within were faint threads of something organic, fibers that looked at first like strands of hair but proved under closer study to be fine, translucent ligaments, stretched and arranged in their own concentric rings, mirroring the sphere inside. The freeze was not haphazard. Whatever process had encased Clara had preserved her perfectly, locking in the pale sheen of her skin, the faint shadow of veins beneath. Even her eyes, visible through the lowered angle of her head, were intact, glazed but unclouded, as though she had been paused mid-breath. And yet, according to the asylum's own ledgers, Clara had been gone for months before the lantern was found, marked down as having wandered off on a storm night. A note written in the same hand that had drawn the spirals in the bell. The investigators speculated endlessly. Some believed the lantern was meant to display her, a private exhibit for its maker, the ice acting as both protection and preservation. Others thought it was a message, a demonstration of control over both the human form and the elements, proof that life and death could be molded into something entirely new. But there was one theory none would put in writing, the one suggested only in glances exchanged over the table. That the lantern was not meant to be opened at all, that it was not a container for her, but a container for something inside her, and that breaking the ice would release what it held. The marsh remained quiet in the weeks after its discovery, the lantern kept in a locked storeroom deep beneath the asylum. But those tasked with guarding it swore the ice never fully melted, even in the warmth. They swore that when they passed too close, they heard a faint sound from within. Not the cracking of thawing ice, but a soft, deliberate tapping, as if something inside was finding the walls. And sometimes, in that dim and airless place, the light would shift just slightly inside the lantern, bending around Clara's frozen form as though refracted by more than ice. For those who understood the precision of Hale's other works, the sphere was no accident. It was a measurement made manifest, a proof that human bone could be bent into perfect geometry without the imperfection of the living will. And geometry in Hale's hands was never just about shape. It was about summoning the exact alignment that opened a door, the kind no one could see until it had already been stepped through. The ledger was never meant to be read for meaning. Its columns were orderly, each name paired with neat dates and terse remarks about diet, incidents, or treatment. But in the margins, in a faint, almost trembling hand, the real record had been written. The ink was so pale it seemed to resist the light, as if it wanted to be found only by someone willing to look too closely. The words were not notes to another person, nor reminders to himself, but fragments of thought that moved between clarity and delirium. They were confessions without apology, the kind that grew only in the mind of someone who believed the world was wrong and could be corrected if he was patient enough. The first of these scrawls was almost harmless. A line about how certain sounds seemed to vibrate the bones of the skull in a way no instrument could match. But the further the margins ran, the darker the music became. Hale wrote of children not as people, but as instruments yet to be tuned. He believed that their bodies, soft and pliable, were raw material for shapes that could contain resonance no adult form could hold. He claimed that in their innocence, in their unformed bones, there was an openness to frequencies the rest of humanity had forgotten. It was not enough to hear them laugh or cry. The sounds of life were too random. The sound he sought was mathematical, deliberate, exact. And to find it, he would have to dismantle them, not in violence, but with the same calm precision as a craftsman carving wood. He spoke of the act not as killing, but as sculpting, each bone placed so that the structure could sing without voice. He described listening to the hollow of a rearranged ribcage and hearing not breath, not echo, but something like the low note of a bell struck far away. The margins became more erratic in places, though the handwriting never lost its steadiness. He spoke of a symbol, a spiral made of angles rather than curves, and claimed it was not a drawing but a map of intervals, a tuning pattern that certain minds could perceive without ever having learned it. For those minds, the symbol was as obvious as a clock face. For others, it was only meaningless lines. Hale believed that he was among the few who could hear the pattern in his head when he saw it, and that the sound it guided him to was not earthly. He called it the sound of God, though his God bore no resemblance to the one preached in the asylum's ruined chapel. His God was not loving, not merciful, but an architect of perfect forms, a being that spoke not in words but in vibration, and would reward any who built the correct chamber to contain its voice. In one passage he wrote of a night when the wind slipped through the broken east wing windows and struck a brass pipe at just the right angle. The note it produced was low and pure, and he claimed it stopped his heart for 2 beats. In those moments he felt himself outside of time, hearing something that pressed against the inside of his skull like the memory of a dream too large to hold. He wrote that the sound had shape, and that it was identical to the sphere he had built inside the lantern, identical to the spiral of bones in the bell. These were not trophies or symbols to him. They were tuning chambers, attempts to replicate that single perfect note, to catch it and keep it before it vanished. Further down the margins, his words turned almost tender. He wrote of the children as if they had volunteered, as if somewhere in their stillness they had understood their role in his work. He claimed they had been chosen for their silence, their patience, their lack of resistance, and that when he began the reshaping, he could feel the sound beginning to hum inside them, faint at first but growing stronger as the structure neared completion. He insisted that in their final moments they did not fear him. They were only listening, waiting for the sound to arrive. He wrote that it did, but never long enough, never complete. Always it slipped away at the final breath, leaving him with only the shell and the knowledge that he was close. By the last of the marginalia there was no trace of doubt. He was certain the tuning pattern was correct, certain that only one more attempt was needed. The ledger itself was undated, but the last faint line in the last margin was still legible, pressed harder into the paper as though to carve it there. One more chamber and it will stay. Then the voice will answer. The main columns of the ledger continued past this, filled with patient names and daily reports as if nothing had changed. But the margins stopped there, and those who handled the book afterward swore they could feel a faint vibration through the paper if they held it too long, as though something unseen still moved through the shape of the letters they had known. Not in the way of whispered rumors that fade when the season turns, but in the way a body knows an old wound, a deep ache that is ignored because to tend it would mean opening it again. For years, the townspeople carried that ache in their quiet glances and lowered voices, a shared secret pressed between them like a sealed envelope no one dared to open. They knew about the disappearances, about the strange stillness in the air when certain children were gone and Hale's lanterns burned late into the night. And they knew, though no one said it aloud, that their fortunes seemed to rise in the shadow of those vanishings. Crops that had withered under months of dry wind began to flourish again without rain. The grain store never emptied, even in winters that stripped other towns bare. Trade flowed back into the market square, coin clinking in pockets that had been empty for too long. It was not joy they felt in those moments. It was relief laced with a shame they learned to bury. There were those who might have asked questions once in the early years, but questions had a way of turning back on the asker in Hale's town. It was easier to nod when he passed, to thank him for his work at the asylum, to pretend that the children who vanished had gone to relatives or simply run away. The mind bends easily when it needs to, and so they bent, reshaping the truth until it fit into something livable. They told themselves there was no proof, only suspicion, and suspicion could not outweigh the fact that their fields stood green while others starved. When Hale's eyes lingered on a child in the crowd, some parents felt the old sickness of fear rise in them, and still they said nothing. Better one gone than many lost, they thought, though none dared put it into words. Over the years, this silence became its own kind of ritual. The people stopped speaking of the missing at all, not even in the privacy of their homes. They learned to look past the flicker of Hale's lantern through the asylum windows, learned to keep walking when they heard strange low tones carried on the wind at night. The town's festivals grew louder, the music and laughter meant to drown out the sounds no one wanted to hear. But under it all was that same shared pulse of guilt, a constant awareness that their good fortune was paid for in something they could not name without shattering themselves. When the truth finally began to seep out, it did not come as a revelation. It came as confirmation. The horror was not just what Hale had done. It was that they had let him, had built their lives on the quiet bargain they pretended did not exist. And in the heavy stillness that followed, the town understood that the silence had been the loudest part all along. The fire came without warning, a deep orange glow swelling against the black sky, swallowing the asylum in a silent, steady hunger before the first shouts rang out. The townspeople gathered at a distance, faces lit by the trembling light, but none dared cross the threshold of heat and smoke. The flames did not roar or scream as most fires do. They moved with an unsettling calm, as though consuming only what they had been meant to. The old brick walls cracked inward under the weight of their own heat, beams sagged and dropped in muffled thuds. Yet through it all, there was no sound of panic from within. Those who stood watching would later admit to themselves that it felt less like a disaster and more like the closing of a book whose ending had been written long ago. By dawn, the asylum was nothing but blackened ruin, the air thick with the acrid sting of smoldered timber and charred plaster. The earth beneath the foundation steamed where the fire had burned hot enough to strip stone to powder. Men sifted through the debris, expecting to find bones or twisted metal, but the ashes yielded almost nothing. No bodies, no remnants of Hale, no proof of the wards and cells that had once been there. All that remained was a single slab of stone untouched by flame, sitting upright in the very center of what had been the lowest cellar. Its surface was etched with a pattern unlike any the townsfolk had seen before, a labyrinth of intersecting lines that seemed to twist into themselves if stared at too long. Beneath that pattern, the stone curved into a hollow space, smooth and deliberate, the size and shape of something meant to be filled. Those who leaned close saw the faint outline of fingernail scratches inside the hollow, and though no one spoke of it aloud, every mind reached the same image. A child curled there in absolute stillness, body pressed to stone, eyes wide in the dark. The edges of the hollow bore tiny grooves, as if whatever lay inside had been sealed away for a time before the fire came. There was no soot on the stone, no scorch mark to suggest it had been spared by chance. It stood as though it had never been part of the burning world around it. The symbol above the hollow seemed deeper than the etching of tools. It had the quality of something worn into being over years of touch and ritual, each stroke carrying a weight of purpose only the one who carved it could have understood. No one dared move the slab. They left it standing in the ruins as the wind swept through the open frame of the sky, carrying with it the scent of smoke and something older, something that clung to the edges of memory like a whisper one cannot unhear. And though the asylum was gone, the townspeople knew that the symbol would not fade, and that whatever had been meant to rest inside that stone space had never truly left it. Years passed, and the ruins of the asylum were slowly stripped of their jagged edges. The scorched beams and fractured stones were cleared away, the blackened earth covered with a soft quilt of grass and flowering shrubs. A path was laid where the central hall once stood, curving gently toward the open sky. The townspeople called it a memorial garden, a place of reflection, though no plaque told the truth of what had been done there. Time gave them distance, and distance gave them comfort, but comfort was a falsehood draped over rot. Beneath the soil, the foundation stones remained cold and heavy, and in the exact center still stood the slab with its symbol. The gardeners worked around it, planting roses at its base as though the gesture could soften the shape carved into its face. The hollow beneath the symbol stayed empty, but no one questioned why it was never filled. It was nearly 50 years after the fire when the church records were unsealed, their brittle pages opened in a cramped archive room far from the garden's calm surface. The handwriting inside was steady, deliberate, and without shame. The pages detailed the inventory taken after the fire, or rather what had been quietly removed before the fire reached its heart. There were no bodies listed. Instead, there was a catalog of objects described in detached terms: preserved folds of human skin, dried and pressed between glass, vertebrae twisted into deliberate spirals, rib bones lacquered and bound into a lattice no anatomy could naturally form. The notes explained that these were of rare craftsmanship and had been passed to patrons of anatomical arts, private collectors whose names were never recorded. Not destroyed, not buried, not hidden. Sold. Passed hand to hand, carried across borders, perhaps still resting in cabinets where strangers admired them as curiosities, unaware of the hands that had shaped them. The records carried a darker suggestion, tucked into a margin in faded ink: that these works were not trophies but tools, each arranged according to patterns Hale claimed were instruments for the listening of divine harmonies. The archivist who read those words would later speak of the unease that took root in him. The way the handwriting seemed to lean forward on the page, as though speaking directly to the reader across decades. No one could say how many pieces had been made, or how many still existed in the world beyond the town. Some believed the slab in the garden was the final piece of the same work, its hollow the missing chamber in a scattered instrument. Others feared that the collectors knew exactly what they owned, and that they were only waiting for the time when the scattered fragments could be brought together again. In the quiet of the memorial garden, visitors laid flowers without knowing that beneath their feet and far beyond their sight, the legacy of Hale had never ended. The town had traded the truth for beauty, but beauty was a thin skin, and beneath it the bone still spiraled, the folds still waited, and the symbol on the stone still faced the open air, as patient as the one who had carved it. It ended not with screams, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles when the last witness looks away, when the last question dies in the throat, when the soil covers not only the dead, but the truth itself. In the town, the garden bloomed each spring, a place for photographs and small weddings, its flowers bending politely in the wind. Children played on the grass above where walls had once trapped the broken and the damned, and their laughter carried over the stone slab without notice. Evil here did not linger in open wounds or obvious scars. It had learned the patience of moss, the discretion of shadow, the stillness of deep water. The old families still locked their doors at night out of habit, not fear, never admitting even to themselves that the habit had been born in the years when Hale walked among them, smiling at market stalls, nodding in church pews, speaking with the warmth of a man who seemed incapable of harm. What Hale had done was not monstrous in the way stories liked to tell it. Sudden violence, bloody walls, a roaring beast that could be pointed to and condemned. His evil had been threaded with purpose, each act fitted into a larger shape invisible to those unwilling to see. The symbols carved into wood and stone had never shouted their meaning, only waited, patient as a heartbeat. The rituals were quiet affairs, often mistaken for harmless oddities, the kind of eccentric habits people excused in someone they believed to be good. He did not need the town's approval, only its indifference, the soft permission granted when horror unfolds just far enough from the hearth to be ignored. In the years after the fire, the silence remained the most dangerous part. For those who had suspected, it became easier to call their memories flawed, to recast strange sights as tricks of the mind, to treat the unease in their bones as a foolish superstition. The absence of proof was not proof of absence, but they clung to the comfort of forgetting. The church records were locked away, the collectors unspoken of, the garden tended as though beauty could scrub away the stains beneath. Even the younger generations who had never known Hale learned from the posture of their elders that some histories were best left untouched. And so, the knowledge faded from common memory, but the shape of the silence remained, ready to form itself around whatever came next. The documentary's last reflection hung in the air like breath on a cold morning. Evil does not always arrive with a shout. It does not always wear the face of a stranger, or move in the open where bravery can meet it. Sometimes it comes in the form of a neighbor's nod, a friend's unexamined ritual, a symbol carved where no one bothers to look. It waits in the corners of rooms, in the cracks of old stones, in the quiet agreements between people who believe they are only minding their own business. If it happened here, in a town that wrapped itself in the comfort of flowers and forgetting, what would stop it from happening again? The question was not meant to accuse, but to remind. The most dangerous evil is the kind that moves unseen, breathing in time with the lives around it until one day it no longer needs to hide at all.